High Confidence, Films and Human Rights in Crisis.
Human Rights Film Festival Berlin podcast on current affairs and culture. Presented by Anna Ramskog-Lawitt.
Through this podcast series, we want to give you weekly insights into the current situation of filmmakers and human rights activists worldwide. We will host talks with outstanding filmmakers, experts and activists about their personal experience and the situation in their countries. We premiere talking to a filmmaker extraordinaire. Rehad Desai from South Africa is an investigative journalist, award-winning filmmaker and civil rights activist. At the Human Rights Film Festival Berlin 2019, we showed his outstanding documentary, Everything Must Fall, about the 2016 student movement in South Africa against university fees. In times of Corona, he is active on many fronts. As a journalist, documenting the harsh restrictions by the South African government, but also as an activist seeking to ensure that his government's response is one that is rooted deeply in social justice and democratic principles. Rehad, thank you so much for joining us today at the premiere of this new podcast. We actually just met 3 weeks ago at the Climate Story Lab in London. For me, it feels like ages ago. How is it for you? How are you?
Yeah, it's been 15 days in self-isolation, given that I came back from the UK and that was the government regulation. I've been for a test. The first few days were quite okay. I started a blog on Facebook, which I haven't been able to keep up. Managed to do 2. But yeah, it's, I thought this would be a wonderful time to reflect and write, and I really enjoy writing, and it's good for me, for my emotional expression. And just to keep connected to the outside world.
For me, it was like weird calling you today to talk about Corona, because we should be talking about climate change, but then we have been overtaken by reality, haven't we?
We have, and in many ways, the work I've been doing over the last 9 months or so around the climate crisis, I think it's prepared me very well. I've had to come to terms with the fact that in the global south, we're going to continually be hit hard, and that impact will be intensified. And I think the demands certainly of the movement that I'm involved in, tell the truth, act appropriately. That means being transparent, act with speed and urgency, and allow the need to start building really deep-rooted community networks. All these things, in many ways, have stood me in pretty good stead.
Back in London, we were already talking that Corona most probably will hit South Africa hard and surrounding countries harder than the European countries. When we were in London, you told me already about power and water cuts in certain quarters. And now we read that South Africa has the world's hardest restrictions with regards to Corona, allowing people only to leave their houses for groceries. In your perspective, working with grassroots organizations and people and social movements, what does it mean for the majority of the 57 million people in South Africa?
Yeah, well, 50% of our population live below the poverty line. And then we have about 20% who would be living in sort of normal, what would be considered in Europe, respectable working class standards, having their own accommodation and maybe some recreational space attached to their property. So this makes it almost, it's showing that it's unworkable because many people are living in overcrowded informal settlements, or what's known as squatter settlements, in shacks, in terrible conditions. And then many of the people who live in the townships that was created by the old system don't have yards to speak of. We've had reports now of people being even shot, being in their yard. And there's been widespread resistance to this. So we've had as many deaths in the course of our 4 or 5 day lockdown now, from the army and the police trying to impose this very draconian legislation, regulation, as there have been deaths related to the corona.
I've read in recent days a bit about former pandemics and how deaths not related directly to the virus or whatever caused the sickness are hardly reported or scientifically looked at. So I can imagine it's similar because honestly, I read quite a lot of European newspapers, so to say, on that, and I haven't heard anything about this re-death, which is striking for me.
Yeah, I think we can expect, given the fact that we haven't been able to throw at the epidemic the resources required for what's termed suppression, which means, mass testing, tracing, contacting, and quarantining, as they've done in South Korea in a relatively democratic way, and China in a less or without democracy really. It means the lockdown is essentially a blunt tool until we can get the reagents from abroad and the swabs and the testing kits. The capacity of our private sector to do these tests sit at 3,000 per day. So that's in total. At the moment, only 6,000 tests per day can be assessed or diagnosed.
Which is not that much if you look at 57 million people.
Yeah, it's estimated that we need at least 20,000. If we can get up to 20,000 tests per day, we're beginning to make an inroad into the data that we need to contain the epidemic. So there's been no shifts. The Treasury, the finance minister, stated that the budgets that he reviewed, that he announced, would stay in place, and that is huge cuts to the hospital services as well as other very important services.
And they stay in place despite Corona. That's striking.
For the moment, let's just hope that shifts. But what's clear is that unless the government wakes up to the fact that this can only be done with massive volunteer participation that comes out of the organised movements through in the townships and informal settlements, the community-based organisations, supplemented by coordinating and support efforts by the many non-governmental organisations we have. We don't have a hope of requisitioning the sort of manpower that's required to really contain the epidemic in any meaningful way. At the moment, we have 1,300 cases and climbing, and we expect that to really start climbing very seriously in the next 10 days or so.
In terms of international solidarity, what was talked about quite a lot in the last weeks, what would you hope for from the European states, but also from the European civil society in that context?
Yeah, firstly, that we would have to ignore the patents on some of the materials and medical equipment and so on that's required to produce the reagents and the testing kits. We have to move to a situation where we open compulsory licenses and we start converting the capacity of our industry to meet the public health needs and the acute shortages, particularly of ventilators and reagents and testing kits and so on. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and I think probably the most important element of this pandemic is, much like the climate crisis, it's a planetary problem and it will require a planetary response. We will need, as the GS of the World Health Organization has spoken of tremendous international cooperation, international burden sharing, and technology transfers and so on to really, there's no solution for one country. And I think there's a awakening realization of this amongst the state. And we've seen efforts led by France and Saudi Arabia to assist in this matter. But you've got to realize the supply chains of medical equipment is very much order as you go, and the big cartels in the purchasing arena have meant that most of the testing kits are going to the global north. The World Health Organization has managed to secure 20% of these urgent supplies, and that ought to be divided amongst the rest of the world. It's not a very equal situation.
It's not, indeed. You're also part, if I understood that right, of the C19 People's Coalition, where, as far as I understood it, organizations in South Africa self-organizing and trying to press for equal measurements to contain corona. Could you shortly explain what the C19's People's Coalition is about?
Yeah, it began with an initiative started on the 18th of March and really morphed into a situation now where we have 170 organizations plus that are behind an approach which calls for a bottom-up approach to the epidemic, to empowering civil society, neighborhood groups, mutual aid networks, civic organizations to open real dialogues and to be working and aligned with government initiatives that are pro-poor, that speak to the most vulnerable, so the homeless and those below the poverty line at this moment of time are given all the resources that are required. The amendments around movements and the control and oversight of the army, civilian oversight of the army, civilian oversight of the emergency measures that have been taken, put into place to really undermine democracy. These are critical elements of a bottom-up approach.
I actually really like the People's Coalition, and I think we in Europe could actually take it as an example, a best practice example. But you're not only active as part of the movement, you're also an investigative filmmaker. So do you see effects of the lockdown on documentary filmmakers and journalists?
journalists are in a position where they, if they've been able to be accredited in the short space of time, are considered as essential workers. Most documentary filmmakers have not been allowed to be accredited as journalists, and many don't see themselves as journalists, quite rightly, but I've been able to access accreditation along with a few other people from my small documentary company. So, and I've been able to work alongside a filmmaker I have a long-standing relationship with, and in the UK and in Belgium. I'm also involved with the media team inside the coalition and sitting on the task team. So I have my hands very busy at the moment. One in tracking the responses on the ground to the epidemic through our film team, and as well as trying to produce media which is of immediate use and relevance to those people from society who are engaged in very important initiatives on the ground, so to speak.
I have two very short questions, which I just love to ask. For me, you are an outstanding filmmaker, but also an activist. So I'm always interested in who inspires the people that I find inspiring. Who would you say are your role models?
In terms of the epidemic, I think the General Secretary of the World Health Organization is providing critically important leadership. In terms of filmmaking, I think now is the time where the personal approach is going to be critical. Then we have the wonderful filmmaker from Israel, Avi. It's going to be very interesting to see what sort of essay type films come out of this epidemic, and how it's possible. We need to develop mechanisms where money of some sort can be gotten to people who are capable and able to make films at this moment. This is going to be for countries like ourselves, it's going to be a long, drawn-out affair. But we can't forget what's historically been called the third world, which are going to be, I think, hit extremely hard. So tremendous challenges, tremendous importance for coming to terms with what's coming at us, the acceptance and going through the grief, but coming through the grief, the other side, stronger, more prepared, more resilient, more courageous. And that's my message I'd like to leave you with today.
That are wonderful words, and I hope that you're right in your optimism. I really think we have to take the chance that this terrible epidemic offers us to change the necessary things to create a more safe and stable environment for everybody. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me in this very strange time. I hope that we will see you in person in Berlin in October for our Climate Story Lab. I stay completely optimistic for that. Then we will be hopefully able to focus on climate change but also on the human and civil rights aftermath of Corona, because I personally think we have to also keep that in mind. And I say thank you for joining us, and goodbye, and hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you. I'm really hoping to be able to join you.
The Human Rights Film Festival Berlin is an initiative by Aktion gegen den Hunger and shows stories of courageous individuals and communities on both sides of the lens, bears witness to human rights violations, and creates a forum to gain new perspectives on our world. More information on the festival, the podcast, and our daily online documentary series at hrffb.de. This podcast was produced and supported by 48 Hearts Productions.